I know we have a few more people coming, but they're stuck in traffic. So apparently the campus is a ghost town, but traffic is always traffic. And I'll never scoff at it again. As a former New Yorker, I have a lot of respect now. My name is Elizabeth Peterson. I'm the director of the museum. Thank you for coming tonight. This is one of a series of lectures that we're doing. The show that you see is here courtesy of the Rubin Foundation. The Rubin family has been very generous to OU and given us the largest gift we've received in our history, which enables us to do an exhibition series every fall and lectures as part of that. So next week, I want to let you know that we have Gail Gelbert. Dr. Gail Gelbert is a friend of mine from Eastern Connecticut State University. She's going to talk about irony. As you can see, there's plenty of irony in Cuban art. She's an expert in Cuban art and art of Japan. And then on November 5th, we've got Nick Marr, who is a professor here, and he'll be talking about Spain and the revolution and the import of baseball into Cuba. That should be very interesting. And then the show is going to go on into December for the spring, just to give you a little idea of what's happening. We've got watercolor. So we're going to have Georgia watercolor through the spring. And later in the summer, we have Audubon. We're doing some beautiful double elephant folio Havel edition prints that we're borrowing from Auburn University. Beautiful, lush. So I'm talking with our biology department. We're going to do all kinds of interesting liberal arts things. So tonight we have Jorge Fernandez, who's vice president of Metro Atlanta Chamber, and who has an incredible story to tell you, and I'm not going to give you any kind of a lead-in, because I don't think I can do it justice. But needless to say, coming from Cuba and becoming an incredibly successful person in business and in life, I thank you very much for coming here this evening. And I'll be your IT person.
You be my IT. Well, thank you for being here. First of all, the first thing I want to say, let's treat this as a conversation. So it's not as a lecture or anything like that. So please feel free to interrupt, ask any questions, and we'll try to play around with the technology. So we'll put you to help. Come on in, welcome. Let me talk a little bit about first who we are as an organization and what's my role in that, on this. And I'm with the Metro Atlanta Chamber, so you're probably wondering what does that got to do with Cuba and with baseball. But the way I like to frame this is it's about a journey and a destination. So I'll start with the destination, and I'll try to connect the dots in between, but the destination is Atlanta. But I work for the Metro Atlanta Chamber. For those of you that might not be aware what the Metro Atlanta Chamber is, we've been around for 154 years. Atlanta has always been the center of gravitas for business in the South. There was a reason why it was destroyed. We had the distinct honor of being the only city that was destroyed on purpose after falling, when we were not even the capital of the South, nor the capital of the state for that matter. Symbol of the city, as you can see, there is the phoenix that rose from the ashes. And today we are the capital of the South in terms of business. The Chamber has been around for 154 years, 100% private organization. We're not government. We don't receive any funds from the government. We try to keep it that way on purpose, so we don't have any political agendas. And our interest is the growth and keeping the economy thriving. So we're about 80 of us that work professionally at the Chamber, and anybody who's who in terms of the economy of Atlanta are members of our board. I lead the international effort, and from the international effort, what we are responsible for is to basically market Atlanta to key markets throughout the world, for the purpose of recruiting foreign companies to come here, and also for helping Atlanta companies grow on international markets. So that's what we do here. We got two individuals here with me from the Chamber that I'd like to introduce. First is one of the interns that is here with us. Arai is from Kazakhstan. And in fact, she worked with the Chamber of Commerce in Kazakhstan, and she's here with us. There are two of them, one working with us and another one at the Civil Rights Museum. And she'll be here with us for about a month. And so today we were talking about, I'm sort of mentoring on her projects, making a comparison between Atlanta and her chambers and how we can work together. And back there, also, Natalie. Natalie also works with our global commerce team, and also her son, right?
Yes.
What's his name?
Preston.
Hi, Preston. Welcome. And then we could take a look about the baseball. And last but not least is my wife Sylvia, and I'll put her to speak later. So that's what who we are as an organization, and what we do to keep the economy going. What I did not tell you is that I'm a pilot. I flew for the U.S. Air Force for 20 years. Always gravitated to international and had numerous assignments overseas. But again, trying to connect the dots on what we're talking about here, being a pilot, I'm always used to flying with a flight plan. Starts at one point, and what is your destination? And of course, we started from the back here, and the destination is about Atlanta. So life is like a journey. You always try to go to a destination, but just like in any flight, you plan to go to the destination, and en route you find weather, or you find a mechanical issue. In fact, I was just talking to a client of ours who arrived today from Argentina, very interesting and to the topic, from Chile, coming to Atlanta. About 4:30 in the morning, 3 days ago, the pilot turns on the light and says, "We got an emergency, we got to land." Guess where they landed? Havana. So very proper, as to a lot of issues, and because of the embargo, they couldn't fly straight to U.S., had to go via Cancun, but they made it to the destination. So that's a good example on how you still make it to the destination, but you have to do course correction based on many things. With life, it's no different. For me, we had a destination, but there were a lot of course correction, if you will, in this journey. And I guess the first, by the way, this is very interesting, because with Sylvia and for me, going around, a lot of these resonate a lot, particularly from our parents, in terms of in fact, we were looking at some of the teams in sports, about trying to figure it out, resonate from our parents, listening to them about what were the teams that played in Cuba. And Sylvia's looking for our grandson a T-shirt from one of the teams from Cuba as a keepsake and stuff like that. So this is a great opportunity to sort of kind of bring everything together. But I guess the first course correction in my journey was the decision on the part of my parents to get us out of Cuba. And that is amazing. It's one of those points that really takes you on a complete different course. And sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I would have stayed there, and how things have changed just because of that change. So life is a series of those corrections. Of course, I had a lot of them. Once we were here, another one was moving to Puerto Rico. That meant many things. Went to school. That's where I met Sylvia. That's where we got married. Another one was a decision to join the Air Force, because that also changed. I had to study business, but then going to the Air Force took me in another area. So again, a series of those different course correction. In the process, we moved many places. After Puerto Rico, joined the Air Force. We lived in Phoenix. We lived in California, in Texas. Washington twice. We moved to Brazil. We lived in Portugal. There was a small stunt in Africa, interesting enough, also around Cubans. And I remember I had the opportunity to work with Cuban forces from the U.S. side in Angola. And one of the things, they invited me to go to one other camp. I was probably the first U.S. military that had a close encounter with Cubans, and I had to have special permission. And of course, I went to their military base, and guess what? The first thing you found was the diamond. for baseball. So again, another correction there. So all in all, we ended up in Atlanta, our destination, and ironically, this first course correction started with a flight out of Havana to Miami and ended into a flight between where we lived before in Norfolk into Atlanta. It was Delta. It was because of a job at Delta that we ended up here. So the point on this was the fact that flights were involved. And talking about destination, not only physically, but also what I like to do is I remember my 5th grade book in Cuba still, where the cover of the book was an aircraft. And it says, I want to fly an airplane. And I remember when I left Cuba, the big emotion, of course, when you were 9.5, 10 years old, was it wasn't leaving Cuba, it wasn't leaving the parents or whatever, but it was about taking a flight. And I knew, so one of the destinations was not just physically, but also that decision that I wanted to be a pilot. So here we are. I wanted to kind of connect the dots so you know how things work. You mind going to the next slide? The gist of this presentation is called The Fantasy That Became a Reality. And this is, of course, a reference to Neverland and the Flight of Peter Pan. I assume that a lot of people know what Peter Pan is, but this is a different angle of Peter Pan. And if you allow me, let's do some technology switching here, and hopefully it will work. But allow me to start the presentation with 2 very short videos to frame this fantasy that became a reality. Go ahead and click the first one. I thought it would work. Natalie, this is the proof. Click again and see. Hopefully it will work. It's trying, right? There we go. It worked well in the computer this afternoon. There we go. Yeah.
You have no clue what it's like to lose your childhood in the space of one day.
I was told, don't worry about it. You'll be coming back in a few weeks.
Mommy, I want to go, Mom, please don't let me go.
2 changes of clothing, 1 pair of shoes, the pair you're wearing, and 1 book. That's it.
This was no fairy tale. This was real life. If you've read the real story of Peter Pan, it's actually a very dark story.
We weren't flown to Neverland. We were flown to anti-Neverland. Neverland, you get to stay a kid forever. Anti-Neverland, your childhood ended the minute you landed.
Once I got here, it was rough, very rough. But that particular moment was full of hope and expectation and a sense of adventure too.
That's one piece of that. It's a very long video, but I just wanted to get the gist. That's why I cut it there. There's another one that shares more of the experience. Second one. There we go. The other one.
A Cuban passport is one of the few things Sylvia Wilhelm has left from her life growing up in Havana. At 14, she was an aspiring athlete when she left in 1961, with a small suitcase and a few dollars sewn into her dress.
I was a pretty good swimmer. I left 85 medals behind and, of course, never saw them again. And that's what I hated the most.
Wilhelm arrived in Miami as Fidel Castro was securing his hold in Cuba. She said her mother, who joined her later in Miami, thought their stay in Florida would last only a couple of months.
They really thought, like people thought at the time, that the government was going too far to the left. There were rumors that Fidel Castro was a communist.
Scores of Cuban families felt the same way. The U.S. Information Agency made this orientation film to address the flow of Cuban children into Miami. Nearly 8,000 so-called Pedro Pan children stayed in foster care, awaiting the arrival of their parents or relatives from Cuba. Some waited years while their families struggled to obtain exit visas from Castro's government.
It's a refugee camp. Roberto is a refugee.
The film is part of an extensive collection at Barry University in Miami. Sister Dorothy Geel is in charge of Pedro Pan materials at the Catholic school. Catholic leaders in Cuba helped arrange flights for children off the island. In Miami, Sister Dorothy says local pastor Reverend Brian Walsh saw that some children had nowhere to go.
Father Walsh discovered this and spoke to the bishop. The bishop said immediately, we've got to do something and get them together, whatever you can work out.
Volunteers in Pedro Pan kept a registry of children arriving at Miami Airport. Father Walsh ran a boarding home for several young men, while foster homes across the country took in children.
Well, I know they were nice when I would cry myself to sleep. I think of my parents. I hadn't seen them in years, and I'm missing them.
Jorge Finley was 11 when he arrived in Miami. His father was an airline executive, and both of his parents remained in Cuba to help other children get on flights out of the country.
I marvel at the courage required to do that, because they did spend 2 weeks in jail.
Finley was reunited with his parents after 2 years in foster care, but he says other Pedro Pan children were not as lucky.
Not every story it maybe had a happy ending eventually, because we got together with our parents for the overwhelming majority of us, or some of us did not.
This month, Cuba's communist government celebrates 50 years in power. In a speech, President Raul Castro made no mention of the 14,000 children of Pedro Pan. In Miami, Sylvia Wilhelm says the experience has left a powerful mark on the first generation of Cuban exiles.
I really think we as Cubans need to sit down and study this very, very seriously. This was a major exodus. Never has happened before in the history of the Western Hemisphere. And I hope it never happens again.
Several waves of Cuban migrants have arrived in Miami since Pedro Pan. For the children who came alone, they say it is important their history is not forgotten. Brian Wagner, VOA News, Miami.
How many of you have heard of Peter Pan before in this context? Anybody? You have?
Yes, I'm from Florida. So.
Okay, so you probably heard about that. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. About 40 years ago, Cuban parents, just like the film hopefully give you a general gist, and we're going to try to digest this and go through some of the key things that we'll probably cover in the film. But about 40 years ago, roughly about a year and a half, 2 years into the revolution, which happens to be called 1960, the year of education reform, brought a lot of changes in Cuban education. One being the confiscation of private schools and religious schools, and then they all became secular. They all became part of the state. I remember very clearly. I went to a Catholic school, and I remember when the military came in and sort of took over the school in a massive organization. It was an all-boys school, and telling us what this meant in terms of the school moving forward. So what happened was that created fear around many parents that a fundamental human right of the right to select education for their children was being threatened. In 1960s, this rumor became very, very vivid through the experience of the parents and their children. And then there was also a concern, not only in terms of what will happen into the education, but particularly for boys below a certain age, that the parent would lose control over the future of the children, and the state, through a law that was called Patria Potestat, which means the fatherland rules, or then will take control of the future of the children. So when you put all this fear together, was sort of precipitated what is now being called the largest recorded histories of unaccompanied minors out of anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. Interesting enough, it wasn't necessarily secret, but it was kept on purposely outside the news. Imagine what it would have been today. I think this would have probably been impossible in the era of 7 days, 24-hour news. But it was kept sort of subdued, and virtually there was nothing written about it. There were 2 instances where they were actually mentioned. There was a reference in 1962 in a Miami paper, and then Reader's Digest had an article on Peter Pan in 1988. So other than those 2 cases, there was nothing written until basically last year when there was an anniversary of Peter Pan, and the Miami Herald started a big campaign just as the movie ended to basically keep the memory alive and trying to record and an attempt to reach out all those children that were part of Peter Pan. The whole program was run by the Catholic Welfare Bureau in Miami, and who is considered the father of Peter Pan is Monsignor Brian Walsh, who sort of kind of put all these things together. Next slide, please. The Operation Peter Pan lasted between December of 1960 to October 1962, and there were 2 phases of that. I'll get to that in a second. But the end result of that was that there were more than 14,000 unaccompanied minors that participated in this program. The interesting thing was that it was totally a grassroots level that was fueled by this fear in terms of the parents leaving worried about the future of the education and what was going to happen to their children. And keep in mind that this happened barely 2 years after the revolution, so the world as Cuba knew it really was falling apart in their eye. So the parent trying to leave this Marxist-Leninist indoctrination fostered this mass exodus of children leaving Cuba. Keep in mind also that the U.S. had diplomatic relations with Cuba at this point, so getting a visa to come to the United States was fairly easy. But nevertheless, the issue was many Cubans left with the whole families, but there was a push to get these children out. And so they left unaccompanied. So that was the origin of Peter Pan. So this grassroots level that was fueled by fears of parents in Cuba, what precipitated was that one individual came to Father Walsh with a boy named Pedro and said, this is what's happening here in Miami. These children are leaving, and told the whole story of what the fear, indoctrination, and education. And Father Walsh became very interested in the plight of these children trying to leave Cuba. So what he did was, he had a meeting, he started to work closely and saw the magnitude of the number of children coming. So he had a meeting with an emissary from President Eisenhower at the time, in which he appointed an individual to look at Cuban affairs, at the issue of immigration of Cuban affairs. So they received a tacit approval from the U.S. government to help sort of accommodate these children. The issue was what to do with the children and where do you bring them. So there was some assistance on the part of the federal government to help the Catholic Archdiocese of Miami to help basically the taking care of these children. At the same time, there was another grassroots level in Cuba that was fostered by the superintendent of Ruston Academy. Ruston Academy was the American school in Havana. And the superintendent of the school was the one that started to help the parents in Cuba with the process of getting the children out. And in December of 1960, the superintendent of the school met in Miami. Keep in mind at this time there was still free flow of flights between Havana and Cuba, not like what happened to my client the day before yesterday. I had to go through Cancun. The superintendent of the school had a meeting with Father Walsh, and then it started to sort of work together, where the superintendent of the school started the process in Havana, getting the children out, and then Father Walsh then took the children and started the process. Again, keep in mind that this is in the context of what was going on at the peak of the Civil War, if you really think about it. So that in reality was the origin of Peter Pan. And even though the receiving end, if you will, was the Catholic Archdiocese of Miami, Ruston Academy was a secular school. It was the American school in Havana. So children of all faiths and creeds and races were part of this Peter Pan. In fact, yes, the majority were Catholic, but there was a huge number of Jewish. There was a big Jewish community in Cuba, the Protestant, and then the people that were not affiliated with any religion. The other interesting thing about this is that this was 1960. A lot of the upper elite in Cuba, given the fact that there was still diplomatic relations, had left Cuba. So the majority of the children that participated in Peter Pan were from the middle class, not from the upper class, because those that were from the upper class had already left into Miami. Go ahead. So the program started, and then on January 3rd, 1961, an event happened, which was the Bay of Pigs. Anybody heard of the Bay of Pigs? It's the invasion of Cuban forces, helped through the CIA to invade Cuba and reclaim territory, and then overthrow the revolution. It was a complete fiasco for many reasons. We could have another lecture just on the Bay of Pigs and the lessons learned on that. But the Bay of Pigs ended the first phase of Operation Peter Pan, and then became a really big roadblock, because now the U.S. the result of the Bay of Pigs was the breaking of the diplomatic relation between Cuba and the United States. We still continue flights, but there was no official relationship. What happened is the U.S. embassies and all its consulates closed down. So now the children that had left in the past through Operation Peter Pan, getting the visas directly from the consulate, no longer had access to any U.S. diplomatic representation to get the visa. This emissary from the Eisenhower administration reacted very quickly and instituted a program that was called the Visa Waiver Program. And the Visa Waiver Program stated that children under certain age did not require a visa to enter the United States. So this gave the lifeline to the second phase of Peter Pan. So up to January 1961, there were a number of children living with the visas after the diplomatic relationship. The exodus continued, but under the program of the Visa Waiver Program. Again, this was in the context of the Cold War. And this was then Kennedy came in and Eisenhower, and then the program ended abruptly during the missile crisis when the world came to the brink of a nuclear war ever. And then that was the origin of the embargo that is currently in place, that does not allow the free flow of transportation in Cuba. And at that point, when the embargo happened, all direct flight ceased. That's why in the previous slide, the time frame of Operation Peter Pan was from 1960 through 1962, with in 1961, January 61, continuing the flight, but under the new program called the Visa Waiver program. After the missile crisis, then it became virtually impossible for the children to continue to leave, because the only way to get to the United States was to third parties, or third countries, which then they did require visas, and still children came out, but the government of those countries, particularly Mexico, Spain, did require children not to travel alone for international law, et cetera, et cetera. So that brought the program into an end. Next slide. Now let's take a look at the dashboard from the chamber. We're used to metrics and dashboard, but this is some very interesting statistics of what happened to these children. So for that amount of time, from 1960 through 1962, over 50% of the children that left were reunited at the airport. The flights were from Havana to Miami. About 50% of those children were reunited on the spot at the airport in Miami. They went through a processing center at the Cuban Refugee Center, but they were immediately reunited either with families that were there before or with friends that basically then took them as foster children within their home. The other 50% of the children were relocated in the United States to over 100 cities in 35 different states, all over, from California to Mackinac, Michigan, to everywhere. So that was the split. About 85% of the children were between the ages of 12 and 18, because that was the age of the military, and then about 70% were boys. Why? Because of the reason that we were talking about, the parents being afraid. Then, I mentioned that Peter Pan ended in 1962. In 1965, under a special agreement between the government of Cuba and the United States, allow for a short period direct flights between Havana and Miami called the Freedom flights, and that allowed for the children that were in the United States whose parents remained in Cuba be able to come on their special program, and 90% of those 14,000 children that left under Peter Pan achieved a reunification rate of 90% with their family in Miami. The other 10%, you might ask, what happened? Parents died in between those at the time, or were not able. They got old. They didn't want to leave, or the government of Cuba did not allow them to go. But the success rate of reunification by 1965 was about 90%. Next slide. Now, just like the film made reference to this, but it's very interesting because just like any other story, everything got the good, the bad, and the ugly. So, what do you think are some of the good things? Any ideas or comments on what would be some of the good things from Peter Pan, of what you have seen or heard, or any? What do you think? I'm sorry? Exactly, experience freedom. Keep in mind the frame of reference of the parents, that the world was coming apart, the government was going to take over, the fear of indoctrination. So the fact that they were on the other side and they were not subject to that were good. The other one is just like what I just mentioned, the 90% reunification piece. And interestingly enough, there were no children lost, meaning 100% of the children were accounted for one way or the other. So nowhere during the whole operation, parents that were left in Cuba never found out what, they might not necessarily be reunified, but the tracking was there for them. The other good, yes?
Why did Castro allow the parents to leave?
Why would they allow it to leave? There was a triage, if you will. Keep in mind that what was happening was after the Bay of Pigs, there was a lot of fear of overthrow of the revolution. So he allowed those parents to sort of, that he thought that were a threat to the revolution because they could undermine the revolution, to leave. However, not everybody. If you're a doctor, most likely you did not leave. If you have some sort of a criminal meaning not necessarily civil criminal meaning like a terrorist committing an act of espionage or counterterrorism, you were a political prisoner. They did not leave. And also keep in mind that this was right after the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs and the missile crisis, so that created a lot of mistrust. So Castro said, this is a good opportunity to get rid of these people. That's some of the good things that happened. The other good thing about was that interesting. I don't think we could have done it. I made reference to that before. I don't think it happened today in the age of CNN and so forth. It was done in secrecy, not in overt and covert secrecy, but it was not in the hype of media. And they did that on purpose for the protection of the children, for the protection so people would not be used as propaganda from one side or the other, either for the Cuban Revolution or the counter-revolutionaries that were in Miami trying to overthrow the Cuban regime. So there was a deliberate attempt to keep the operation low-key. Which was a very good thing. The other part was a very inclusive operation. It wasn't restricted to one race, or it wasn't restricted to one economic strata or one religion, given the fact that it was run by the Catholic diocese in Miami. And the other good thing about it was the fact that because once the children were here, particularly those that were able to claim their parents that remained behind up to the missile crisis until 1962, there were thousands of visas for parents processed through the children that were already in the United States, which allowed those people to come to the United States, which was very, very good. Where it started to get bad was in the issue of what do you do with the children. Those 50% that were taken by family or by friend, great, but for the other one, think about the experience of a 12, 13-year-old boy or girl that comes through to a brand new country. They're relocated. They go to a country. This is trauma. Even if you were with family or friends that were not your parents, just the separation of children and parent is traumatic. Put yourself in that decision. For those of you that have children, to put your children on an airplane, you go, and we may or may not see you. Of course, one of the good thing about it in the frame of mind of many of the parents was no one thought that the United States will allow a regime such as Marxist-Leninist at 90 miles from the coast of Florida. So this was a very temporary type thing. So most of the parents that let the children go thought that this was a 6 month thing, and then everybody will be back in Cuba and everybody will be fine. So that sort of helped the frame of mind of letting the children go. The fear of indoctrination, whether it was real or not, footprint on this, there's not any evidence, by the way, that the Cuban government was in fact going to take over the children. The education reform was true, but the fact that after turning 18-year-old that the government was going to take over, there's no proof that was really true. So, but nevertheless, perceptions as real as fact, and fear is a determinator of that. So the parents made the decision to put these children out, and that's a tremendous act of courage. And at the end, the real heroes here, like I said, are the parents that really took those decisions to take these children out. However, when it comes, and there was reference on the film, the experience of the children varied tremendously. There were some really great stories that people that made it had no problem. Yes, you have the trauma, the separation and all that, but at the end, when everything was sifted, there was a very positive experience. There are children that had more difficulty because they were not well received by certain families. Some family adopted them and they threw them out in the street. There are records of that. In fact, the first bedroom that I mentioned, that is recorded, that ended up as a homeless. Because of the family that took him did not, and then Father Walsh took him back in. To some really nasty cases that people have good intentions, some of the people have bad intentions, so some of them went through some bad, but that's the minority. There are some children that thought that their parents did not have any right to put them in this situation. And if you continue to watch that film that was put together by CNBC, there's interviews of the bad, the good, and the ugly. And some of the uglies, there was a big debate by saying, why did my parents put me on this separation anxiety? I did not want to come to the United States. I wanted to stay in Cuba, so why did they force me to do that? And some of them still live with that anxiety, or that guilt feeling, if you will. Particularly those that never got to see their parents again. So all that goes through the mind, the psychology of the children. Around Peter Pan, there are all sorts of speculation of conspiracy, that this was a plot of the CIA to undermine the Cuban Revolution. Interesting enough, again, there's no proof. There was a court case that on the open record that went to court and sued the U.S. government for document to prove that CIA was behind Operation Peter Pan, and the person who sued the U.S. government is a Cuban American, but she's one of those Cubans that did not appreciate the parents. So she thought that she was a pawn between the two governments. Again, there is no proof that this was a plot a deliberate plot. However, what it did do, Peter Pan, was keep in mind that when Peter Pan was going on, the Bay of Big happened. No one knew that was a secret operation of an invasion. When the Bay of Big happened, a lot of the counter-revolutionary came out to the street. So the visa waiver program that came out found a way of some of these counter-revolutionary to get the children out as a safe haven, so they would not have any retribution against their family for being counter-revolutionary or supporting the invasion. So that did happen. So the fact that the visa waiver itself, the act of the visa waiver, did help to mitigate some of the things that were instigated by the CIA through the Bay of Big, but it wasn't a deliberate attempt of the CIA to underwrite, if you will, Operation Peter Pan. So all these things have not been really proven. So the success or the wisdom of the program, it's still in controversy. And you can think why. It's not, nothing is clear from that perspective. These are great stories. Some regret for some very negative experience, some very positive. But at the end, it kind of brings it into the conclusion that this was, like I opened on the first slide, where this was a fantasy of the Peter Pan flight that actually became a reality for many. Now, I participated in Peter Pan. I was in the second wave, if you will, because I left Cuba in 1961 with my sister. My sister went to an all-girls American school in Havana that was a sister school of the Ruston Academy. So a lot of the people that she dealt with in terms of friends had the direct contact with the headmaster of Ruston Academy. So she was able, through her friends, to be able to get both of us through the visa waiver program, and we came to Miami, and we were part of those 50% that were placed with a friend or family in Miami itself. So in my particular case, one of her classmates was already in Miami. They belonged to that group that left Cuba immediately. He was a dentist. He was very much associated with the U.S. Embassy in Havana. So they left Cuba right after the revolution. So they took us in their home. But they, in turn, were living with an American family. So we were nested within the nest in a second family. And again, connecting the dots and the common denominator in all this is flight. I told you that I remember my 5th grade book being the cover was an airplane. That American family that took the family that took us, he was a Pan Am pilot. So I really look at him like a hero. I remember walking him out of the house in uniform, and that sort of created. And I remember, nothing. You left Cuba with a bag and a set of clothing, and that's it. I remember that the family bought a mattress for us, and we were sleeping on the floor on the mattress, and I took the box that it came in and created an airport out with paper planes. So we were, my parents were able to leave before the missile crisis, and then we were reunited, and we went to Puerto Rico, and we were raised in Puerto Rico. Now Sylvia had a similar experience, but you want to tell your story quickly? I mean, because your parents, because you left.
It's okay.
Well, basically, from that perspective, her brother had left before, but then Sylvia, with her parents, were able to leave together into Miami. So it was it was during the same time, but under a different program. And then, unfortunately, I was going to have another person that is one of Sylvia's students that was going to come here to represent a complete different generation of Cuban, which, interestingly enough, he came to the United States, what, 4 years ago, more or less? 6 years ago. He had no clue of Peter Pan. He'd never heard of Peter Pan. He had no idea what Peter Pan was. So I thought it would have been great to have him here, but unfortunately, he has about 3 jobs, and he's working tonight, and he couldn't be. But it's interesting because it's 3 different experience at three different journeys that, at the end, the destination brought us back to Atlanta, and it was a flight because I came here because of Delta, because of a job at Delta, and now another flight. I just came back from India promoting Atlanta in India, so it kind of a big circle from Peter Pan to Atlanta. One interesting thing is, it's that Sylvia, Angel, myself are all American by choice. Don't ever forget that, which is a sort of sobering thought to finish this presentation. So this is it. Thank you for helping me. Natalie helped me put this thing together. I really appreciate it.
We have time to take questions.
Sure, absolutely. Or comments. It doesn't have to be about this. Yes, ma'am.
Have you been back to Cuba?
Yes, twice. Because of business. When I was at Delta, the current embargo allows certain cases to travel directly from the United States to Cuba. Travel to Cuba to a third country is illegal. Technically speaking, you could be arrested, you could be fined, and so forth. So the only way to go legally to Cuba is on a direct flight between the United States and Cuba. And there are different cities that are designated gateway to Cuba. Atlanta is one of those. And when I was at Delta, we had a flight of Delta. It could not be marketed as Delta. You would never find Havana in Delta's timetable. but it was done through a third company that had the sanction of the U.S. Treasury and Department of Justice to take the flights to Cuba, and there are about 12 or 13 different permits from the U.S. government that allows you to fly to Cuba: religious, family reunification, humanitarian, agriculture. The governor of Georgia went to Cuba a few years back under the agriculture. So anyhow, we had those flights. So I went on the inaugural flight, and it was kind of emotional. But the one that was really interesting was about 2 years later, we had a problem with fuel in Havana. The pilots were complaining there was water on the tanks because the flight that comes directly, the international terminal is brand new, it's very nice, but the flights that come from Havana to the U.S. operates at a different terminal. The tanks are very old, and there was filtration of water. So we had to go there and resolve the issue. The person that went there treated going to Havana to sample the fuel as if we were going to Abilene, Texas, and it almost created a diplomatic situation. So I had to go back there and resolve the issue. I was there for 3 days. So I was a guest of the Cuban Civil Aviation Ministry, and it gave me the opportunity to visit things that my house. It gave me the opportunity to see places that I remember, and were also places that I've heard, but I was too small to go, like the place where Henry used to go to drink mojitos, or the daiquiri was created before it's the first time the blender was ever used in a bar to create a daiquiri. So I always wanted to go there. So those were the 2 times that I've been back. It was sort of, it's interesting because I always said, keep in mind that I left when I was 10. Then I was raised in Puerto Rico, then came to the U.S., Puerto Rico being part of the U.S., but went in the Air Force. So Cuba, to me, was like a book. Once you read chapter 1, you don't go back. When you read a book, normally you don't go back. So Cuba, to me, was a chapter in my life. But it was interesting, it was when the second time that I went to Cuba, on that incident on the aircraft, that really lighted an urge to go back and go with Sylvia and go with our girls so they could see the roots. Unfortunately, right after that, the U.S. tightened the embargo. The embargo is a huge political tool between the U.S. and Cuba. The biggest beneficiary of the embargo is the Cuban Revolution, because it is an excuse to explain the failure of the revolution. Because every country in the world traded with Cuba except the U.S., and the failure of the Cuban Revolution from an economic perspective is blame on the embargo, which is hogwash. So the lifting of the embargo is the best thing that could happen. But Fidel Castro is very astute, and every time that the U.S. gives signals to improve the relationship with Cuba, he does something to stir the political right in the U.S., whether it be a Democrat or a Republican, the embargo gets tougher. In fact, it was President Clinton's first administration that codified the embargo, which means it was the first time ever in U.S. diplomatic history that a foreign affairs decree left, which is in the hands of the president, now rests in the Congress. And it was because of political issues to gain the Cuban vote. Florida has always been a swing state, and the Cubans are big voters. So to placate the Cuban, that's why you have senators from Oregon where there's not a Cuban in sight voting on Cuban American issues, because the Cubans learned very well from the Israeli lobby. In fact, on how to do things in terms of foreign policy. But things are changing. As the older generation passes, the new generation will look at Cuba from a different perspective. But the embargo is a difficult situation because the best thing I could describe it is an emotional issue. Embargo makes no sense rationally. Opening diplomatic relations with Cuba makes sense rationally, but emotionally it's different, because if you're one of these Peter Pan that never got to see your parents, or your parents were sent to the firing squad, there's an emotional attachment that brings rationalization out. Somebody had a question? No? Oh, okay. Yes.
A couple of questions. So you're talking about social media today and the 24-hour news cycle and how this couldn't happen, obviously. But a few decades ago, I guess it was a decade and a half or something, the Ilion incident, for lack of a better word, happened. And that was, I was in Florida at that time, and it was all over the news all of the time. Do you think it would be even heightened today? What do you think the public reaction would be to something like this?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Interesting enough, because on one of my lives, I came back to National Security Agency to work Cuban affairs. So I worked the immigration issue at Guantanamo and all that type of thing. And remember when the Cuban flight, the Cuban American flew over Havana and the airplane was shot, and we tried to keep calm down and get everybody when the Iran case happened. What would happen? What's the intent of your question? I mean, in terms, would it be?
Do you think that as Americans we would accept these children and be fighting to get their parents over here?
What you mean, like if Peter Pan would happen
Yeah.
today? Look what happened in the border in Mexico.
Yeah.
So that's the and it's unfortunately the immigration debate has come out of hand. In our job, what we do is we recruit companies here. So when we recruit companies, we grow in the expat community, the foreign community in Atlanta, which are executives. And the state spends a lot of money sending delegations out to promote Georgia and stuff like that. And we bring these people here. And then we had an issue with driver's license, where an executive gets a visa, and the Georgia driver's license is linked to your visa. So what happened is when your visa expired, your Georgia license expires at the same time. So it became an issue. We had a whole family from Samsung had to go back to Korea because they couldn't drive here. I had the CEO of Yamaha driving the CFO because he couldn't drive. It was a disaster. So we tried to get Georgia legislation support to do a stopgap between the visa and the driver's license, and we got caught in the immigration debate that had nothing to do with that. So anything that deals with immigration is caught in this debate. So it's a very
Yeah. And circling back to baseball, because that's my world. I love baseball, and I grew up in Florida, and I work for the Braves now. And
Oh, you do?
Yeah, I do. So I love baseball. And my neighbors growing up were Cuban, and they were always playing baseball in the backyard. Was baseball already a big deal in the 60s?
Oh,
Were
yeah.
these kids coming over and
Oh
ready
yeah,
to
yeah. Baseball.
play the
In
games?
fact, if you go to some of the book, baseball has been in Cuba since the 1800s,
Oh, wow.
when Cuba was still part of Spain. Yeah, there's an interesting book in there about the history of baseball in Cuba. I mean, it's amazing what this last stuff. If you like baseball, you will
I
like
should check it
it.
out.
Because since the 1800s, yeah, Cuba, baseball has been big. And a lot of Cuban baseball players play with the major leagues here, and that's still the dream. I talk to baseball, it's a great tool. That, in fact, when we were, we had a proposal to have in Guantanamo the baseball game between the U.S. forces and the Cuban forces. Unfortunately, that's when the plane was shut down. The idea was shut down too. But baseball is a great tool for foreign policy from this, in the good sense of what's called people-to-people approaches, and that's good. And even today, Angel, which is Sylvia's student, will tell you. And there was an interview the other day about this Cuban baseball defector that since he was a little kid, he was children of the revolution. He knows everything about American baseball, and his dream was to play.
Yes,
Yeah.
It's a big deal.
And now he's making millions. Yes, sir.
Just a quick question. Were the organizers of Operation Peter Pan ever influenced by the kinder transports out of Germany in 1938?
Somewhat. There has been a lot of comparison between that and when they took Jewish children.
Right.
And there was another one to Holland and Denmark about exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And it's interesting, again, linking this to my current job. Actually, Sylvia was part of that. The Porsche project going in, at the airport, Porsche the cars, the German cars. They're putting a big customer experience center. And I worked that project. One of the people that worked that project bringing that racetrack that they're putting right next to the airport. But this project started about 5 years ago. we had the opportunity to go to Germany, to Leipzig, where Porsche has the Cayenne testing and customer experience. And we were hosted by the Leipzig City Hall, the mayor. We took the mayor of Atlanta with us at the time of church in Frankfurt. So the mayor invited us, and the mayor of Leipzig, and we were at a table with one of the East German, because Leipzig is in the former East Germany, and he was in charge of the reconciliation of properties when German reunification. We had a very similar experience, as Peter Pan was a much smaller number, but a number of children that was helped to leave unaccompanied to West Germany in the 50s. But we didn't have the 1950s. Yes, sir.
I have some airplane questions.
Anything is valid.
You mentioned TWA. Was that the main carrier that was bringing people?
No, Pan Am.
Oh, excuse me. I mean, sorry, Pan Am. Yeah. And what kind of airplanes were they?
EC6.
EC6. And is there a civil aeronautics in Cuba today?
Yes, there is. In fact, the one that hosted me when I was there was the equivalent of the civil aeronautics.
Okay. And what kind of airplanes do they have?
Interesting enough, for many years they were flying Soviet airplanes, Ilyushins, and they still have Ilyushins. They fly a lot of Ilyushin in Cuba, but Cubana de Aviación flies American planes and French planes. In fact, I was just recently in Barcelona, Spain, and I took a picture. I have it here of a 767 from Cubana. They're leased from foreign carrier. They cannot be leased from.
So that's how they get around the embargo. So the American plane is leased by another.
Oh, you'll be surprised what people do with those supply. Interesting. China, when we had a conversation with one of the main Chinese airlines, and they wanted to lease an airplane from us in Delta. And I was wondering, because they have this, they wanted to lease a 777, and they have plenty of 777s. And I said, why do you want to lease an airplane from us? And this is a Chinese government airline. And he says, it's because if we lease an airplane that doesn't have a Chinese registration, we could put on board whatever we want. I mean, in terms of magazine, newspapers, in-flight, and anything. If the plane has a Chinese registration, the Ministry of Propaganda is the only one. And since they were trying to bring in foreign business, and they didn't want to hear propaganda, so they wanted to lease foreign aircraft so they could put on the in-flight entertainment system Western stuff. So it's all sorts of things interesting on the aviation. But it was a DC-6. I can tell you exactly where I was seated at.
No, that's where you see. Could you see the wings? And the
I did. I was on the window. My sister was there and we were in row 14.
You could see the motors there.
Yeah.
That's what they have. Thanks about that.
Exactly.
I left with a waiver visa,
I also see.
1961.
So we're the same thing. So you have a similar experience then. Were you reunited at the airport, or were you
No.
in Miami, or were you in a
No.
foster?
No. I went to Villanova University in Cuba.
Okay.
So my mother went to ask one of the priests if I should leave, and he said, she's happy now. Then, since my father had business in the United States, we had visa, but they expired.
So
he said, go to the embassy January 3rd and wait for me outside. I'm going to get her the visa. And he came out and he said, go home. The
Right.
relationship
It's
just...
gone, so then you were able to get
Another priest got me
the visa waiver. Interesting enough, I'm glad you mentioned that, because even though the Catholic Archdiocese in Miami was behind all this, the Cuban Catholic Church officially was not. There were a lot of priests individually that facilitated this thing, but it wasn't a coordinated operation, let's say, between the Archdiocese of Miami and the Archdiocese of
These priests were Americans.
But it was good. But there were also Cuban priests that were involved, but they were individually. They were not. And the same thing, my sister's school was there were nuns, and there was the nun that could communicate with the restaurant academy. You just see what you have. So you were Peter Pan.
I came by myself and I went to live with the nuns, Dominican nuns in Philadelphia.
In Philadelphia. So there were places. Great. So your experience with very positive with them?
Yes, at the beginning it was hard. I wanted to go back.
Yeah, that was it.
When I sent the letter to my father, it was a big deal. He couldn't sleep and all that. So that professor from Illinois was writing me, and then he got better. Then we got married. My father never left. He died in Cuba.
See, you were part of that 90%. I mean, 10%.
My mother left many years later.
But that was part of the
my
trauma.
experience has been very positive. Very
Right.
happy to be able to be here.
It's interesting because I haven't had this conversation with my sister because we left together. Of course, I was 10, she was 17. I'm sure that her thought process was different than mine because of the age difference and the separation and anxiety. So everybody reacts to things differently. That's
21.
no.
I was older.
And you were reunited with your mother later?
Yes, after we got married and I have 2 kids.
Oh my goodness.
She had to go from Cuba to Mexico, from Mexico here.
See, yeah, I think the older you get, the worse from the traumatic piece was worse. That to me was an experience.
Well, I thought I was coming here on vacation.
Yeah.
For a while.
For a
And
while,
then
yeah.
I will be back.
And we'll be back.
And my father used to say, how come you're so happy leaving? And I thought I was going to be, studying here and then...
Going back, exactly. No one thought that it was going to last.
I think that was the premise for 100% of the people. And I think that actually that's what made, like you were saying, part separations, the parents letting the children go. Because everybody was absolutely 100% sure that it would be for 3 months. And that would be it. So the children couldn't understand, especially younger children, they didn't relate to that. But the parents letting the children go was based on that. It was almost a fact that the reunion would be a couple of months, 3 months max.
And I was in Cuba when we had the Bay of Peace.
Right.
And I have a lot of friends in there.
So what brought you to Atlanta?
I went
Me?
from...
I was transferred here from New Jersey.
From New Jersey? See, everybody's got their own journey story. The destination is always Atlanta here now. What else? Great.
Well, could people go back if they wished?
Now?
Or during that whole period, so from the time you came till now, could you have gone back at any time?
No, it's not, no. Because of the embargo.
That includes,
we can go back.
No, yeah, but
Because
now.
we were born there.
No,
Not that
but
I
not
want to.
before. I mean, this was after after many years. The embargo was sort of for lifted on reasons why the U.S. government would allow you to go, and family reunification was, or family, they call it humanitarian, was one of those that were allowed to go to Cuba. When I went to Cuba under the auspices of Delta, for example, I could have taken. You could go and visit parents or siblings or offsprings, but also aunts and uncles and stuff like that. In 2000, when the planes were shot, which must have been in 2006 or 2007, it was tight. They still allow it to go, but they decrease the amount of money you could spend. They decrease the amount of money you could remit. And the reunification was limited to only parents, the immediate family. Well, President Obama has expanded that. So the big debate, in fact, the New York Times had an article this week about to visit the embargo situation and stuff like that. But it's restricted.
Well, in the 60s when we left, our citizenship was taken away from us.
Mm-hmm.
We could not go back because we were not Cuban citizens anymore.
Right.
So that was my question. So you were not a Cuban citizen?
No.
Was stripped by the U.S. by the Cuban government.
Cuban government. I see. Okay. So since you were not a Cuban citizen, you couldn't just
you couldn't go.
We were the bad people.
Right,
at
yeah.
that time.
They call it gusanos.
Right,
Worms.
exactly.
But
Well, and
also,
it's continued, I mean, our speaker last week, who's just left the island last year, he was talking about Cuban baseball players, if they defect, their record is basically stricken. I mean, they're never talked about again on the island. That's
It never
it,
existed.
you've left, it's like you never existed.
But it was also very different. When the Russians were subsidizing the Cuban economy, you didn't have a chance. If you went, you took the risk of not coming back.
Exactly.
So
Things
it changed because they had opened for tourism. So they were begging for these Cubans to come back because they were dependent on people like them sending money back for their economy to survive.
The collapse of the Soviet Union was a major watershed in terms of all this that we're talking about, because the Soviet Union was subsidizing everything. And then when that collapse started the period, or what do they call it, the period?
Special period.
The special period. And you really got, so the only way to do it is the Cubans started to say, okay, you can come back and deal with dollars and stuff. Yeah.
So they lost their citizenship there, so they're like totally one country. Did they all become citizens here? If they chose or they?
Yeah, after so many years, that you apply for permanent residency, and then after residency, then you could apply for citizen. When did you become a U.S. citizen?
69.
In what, sorry?
69.
1969. Yeah, your parents became right away. My parents took a little bit longer. In fact, when I became a cadet in the Air Force, I was not a U.S. citizen, and the only restriction was I needed to become a U.S. citizen before I got the commission. So I got the citizenship about a year before graduation. Because as an officer, as an enlisted, you don't have to be a U.S. citizen, but as an officer, you do. So, and because at the time, now they relaxed, but before, when you have the residency, you have to leave the country and apply to come back. It was very complicated. No, Puerto Rico is part of the U.S. Those that were living in Puerto Rico have Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic. It was sort of convoluted way that made it good, because that's the way. It's even today. That's the way to get the special permits and stuff like that. You have to leave the country and come back. That's why some of the executives, when they're on the visa, they have to go back to their home country and come back. So that applies to everybody. It's part of that's what we need immigration reform.
I don't want to interrupt this good conversation, but I have a small child who I need to get
Absolutely.
a very
And
small
we'll
child.
well,
But
thank you
keep
very-
talking, I'll just quietly duck out. Thank you
No,
very much.
thank you very
That was
much.
absolutely wonderful. Thank you.